Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isvaran, and with me today is the former acting secretary for the Department of Homeland Security and current president of Wolf Global Advisors, Mr. Chad Wolf. Welcome, Chad.
Well, thanks for having me, Heather. Pleasure to be here.
Sure. So, as you know very well, DHS is so much more than a headline. And we've asked you here today to talk to us about your experience during the last administration and give us a little more information about the Department of Homeland Security in general, but more specifically, some of the policy and strategies and the opportunities and challenges that you experienced there. To begin, let's talk about you though first. How'd you get into the government anyway?
So, I grew up in Texas, and coming out of college, I knew that I wanted to give back to my country in one way or another. Wasn't part of a military family, didn't have that background. So joining the military really wasn't a calling for me, but as I decided to give back, I had a strong interest in both history and politics, which led me to DC eventually. And I decided to work on Capitol Hill, again, less for political reasons and more because I liked the policy of what folks on the Hill at that time were doing. So became a legislative aide to a number of senators at the time and worked in the United States Senate, and was there the morning of 9/11 and, was evacuated from the Senate office buildings like many in the Capitol complex were that morning. And it really had a profound effect on my professional outlook going forward. And I had the opportunity a short time there after to join the Transportation Security Administration, which was the newest agency created in the aftermath of 9/11. And that was in early 2002. And I decided to do that really, without a lot of assurances of what I would be doing there, a salary, a job title, all the things that people, are very important to folks as they take on jobs. I just wanted to be a part of something that was going to make a difference and was going to be a response to what I viewed was obviously an attack on the U.S. So dived into that and worked there for 3.5 to 4 years. And we did some incredible work at TSA, standing up the federal, presence that you see at over 450 commercial airports today. So there's a lot of work that went into that and a lot of long nights. And then in 2003, that was folded into a new department, the Department of Homeland Security, which was created. And so you then had the challenges of bringing the disparate pieces around the federal government into one department designed to protect the homeland. Had the ability in 2017 to join back up in the department. And I thought I would do that for a couple of years, not knowing that I would be there for 4 years and serving through some pretty, dramatic policy debates within Washington, D.C. and some formidable times, within the department's young history as well. We had a number of historic hurricane seasons, particularly in 2017 with Harvey and Maria and others, wildfire season in 2018 and 19, and a lot of immigration and border security, a lot of counter-terrorism. So there's a lot of things that went on in those 4 years that there's some good, there's some bad. And there's always, things that you would like to do differently, but a lot of things that we're also very proud of. And so left there in January of 21 and have been eager to do this venue and this talk, because I think a big part of what I tried to do during my time at DHS is just try to explain what the department does. I think a lot of people listening today might think they know, and a lot of them probably do know, but there's still, I find, a lot of misconceptions about what the department can and can't do, what it's responsible for, what it's not responsible for, and sort of everything in between. So even though I'm not part of the department any longer, I still like to talk about it. I still think they do a great mission. It's a great mission, and the dedicated men and women there are there to serve the country and the homeland. And if I can continue to support them in the private sector, then I'm happy to do that. That's
great. Let's go back to your time at TSA, because one of the things that I'm fascinated with, and we study at the center, is, we have these huge events and they're always different, right? We go from one disaster to another, and usually there's somebody who's thought about it before. But with TSA, you were able to stand up this new agency And what are the challenges of doing that in government after a huge event like we had?
It was complicated on a number of different stages in the TSA example, because not only were you trying to guard against another 9/11 style aviation attack, which, you know, you kind of have to go back to that mindset. We really thought that there was another one imminent, but you were also standing up a new agency. So you're hiring employees, you're putting together an HR system, you're putting together procurement systems. And so everything's on a parallel track, and it's very clunky and very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some immense challenges. Not only, it's one thing to hire, you know, a workforce and you're at a central location, but in this case, you're at 450 different airports across the country, and you're hiring a workforce that's very diverse, in a workforce that has different levels of education,
Mm-hmm.
levels of expectations of a new job like that. I mean, I think a lot of folks thought that you were going to go in and be the heavy hand of law enforcement in these airports. And that's not how it ended up being. I mean, the airports and airlines are regulated entities with the federal government. And so they are used to that regulatory environment, which is very different than a law enforcement, you know, do this, you
Right.
know, at the time. So it was a learning experience. Then you have 450 what we call federal security directors, which are those SES positions out in those airports, and trying to interface with all of that and do that in real time while still responding to threats. Like I said, it made for a lot of long days, a lot of long weeks. We didn't get it perfectly correct, but at the end of the day, we were able to deploy a field force of about 45,000 screeners across the country. We deployed over a couple of thousand what we call explosive detection systems, EDS machines that screen check baggage and your carry-on baggage, and trying to, you know, get the dollars from Congress and procure those dollars and get them under contract and maintenance and everything like that. It was certainly a big effort.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of people helping. We had a lot of people from around the federal government and the private sector, for that matter. We had loaned executives, and the best example I can give you is we had to figure out lines, you know, just basic lines at airports, because we knew as we did more security screening, there were going to be longer lines. There's no way to get around it. So who did we hire? We decided to call in Disney. And so we had a loaned executive from Disney who was their line management expert, that knew how to.
Sure.
So there was some ingenuity back in right after 9/11, that we knew we didn't have all the answers. And so we had to rely on the private sector, but it was exhausting. I have to tell you, after 3.5, 4 years, it was exhausted, but it was highly satisfying, and I wouldn't change it.
Mm. Yeah, that's such a great example of how government can work, you know, and we see it with the vaccine now, that we've leaned on the private sector and hopefully brought forth something that was what will become, unfortunately, normal, but needed. The vaccines it's a miracle.
Numerous examples when you talk about the Homeland Security enterprise of how do we secure the homeland. And I tell everyone, and I did when I was at the department, you know, DHS alone cannot do that job. And so you rely on the private sector, as you indicated during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a variety of other examples. Cybersecurity is a great example. Emergency management response is a great example. A lot of nonprofits, a lot of NGOs really go into making, you know, life after a disaster achievable for a lot of, you know, U.S. Citizens that are impacted. So there's example after example about the goodness of that partnership.
I'll just say I agree with you. The private sector is a huge partner in the NGOs. Tell us, though, what are some of the things that DHS is doing right in terms of current policy?
So I think one thing that we tried to do, and I think they're doing a good job of it, is making sure that they continue to evolve with the threats of the day. Mm-hmm. So what do I mean by that? I think, you know, the threats that we faced after 9/11, or even let's say, you know, 6 years ago, are different than the threats that we face today. So the challenge, it's both a challenge, but it's also something that the department's fairly successful on. The challenge is, how do you continue to innovate and evolve with that threat, knowing that you are, you know, given resources by Congress and have to adhere to a construct that maybe isn't always the most efficient.
Right, to say the least. Yeah.
And so I think the department's pretty good at that. They constantly want to do that. We constantly are looking at the threat, or they should be looking at the threat, driving resource decisions, driving management decisions and allocation decisions. And once they stop doing that, then they've got a problem. But everything that I've seen over the last several years and now going forward, they seem to be doing that. They seem to understand the threat and evolve with the threat. And I think that's where the American people expect the department to do. It's not something that's easily done by a federal agency and department. You're usually appropriated money for a year at a time. It takes time to get contracts underway. It's just quick actions are not the hallmark of a federal agency. And so the department's pretty good at it. They can do better. But so far, I've seen from them, they continue to evolve, in a very, very rapid way. And then I think the other thing that they do really well at DHS is really using a lot of their authorities to maintain that operational flexibility and helping one another out. So if in the middle of a hurricane response to a hurricane, it's not just FEMA, and I think a lot of folks think of FEMA, but you have Coast Guard air assets that go up and are looking for survivors. You also have CBP, which is our Customs and Border Protection. You have both air assets and their maritime assets involved. So they're redeploying from different parts of the country, whether it's to Florida, the Gulf, or elsewhere. And so, so that's just on, disaster response. You could talk about the border, and a lot of people, obviously think of border protection and ICE, but you have Coast Guard folks down there, and you had them back in 2019, where we had to send Coast Guard medical teams into Border Patrol facilities to really figure out what was going on there. And so this whole of effort approach across the department to address any one of our missions it's a great example of how an agency and a department should work at the end of the day.
Yeah, and if I put my government hat on, there are policies in place to protect the taxpayers' money as well, to provide against waste and whatever. And it's kind of this delicate balance you have to use on both sides, because you need to have the rules and regulations, but you also need to have the agility. And that brings me to something like China or cybersecurity, where the threat is, daily and it's ever evolving. How could you possibly meet that threat and be agile? Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, no, it's certainly a good question. So when we look at cybersecurity, obviously a big push over the last 3 or 4 years was to create what we call our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, into an operating component. And so before, while it was looking at cybersecurity measures, it wasn't operational. And so it was very hard to get programs up and running. And so that was a big push that we did back in 2018. And it's taken time to get that into a battle rhythm. And so they do a lot of good work, and there's flexibilities written into law. And so I think that's another key element here, is they have different hiring flexibilities as well as budget and procurement flexibilities, because I think Congress and others have recognized that cyberspace, that cyber environment is very different than a traditional environment. And so they're having to compete, as you can imagine, maintaining good people with, the tech companies that, as you can imagine, pay a little bit more than the federal government. It's certainly a challenge, but they're not perfect at the end of the day. But they do a relatively good job. CISA does from a federal network standpoint. Mm-hmm. And then it goes back to that interface with the private sector. And so cybersecurity is all about, that collaboration with the private sector, because they have a lot of resources. They have a lot of talent that, the federal government has to rely on to address a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of compromises and the like. And I think what the federal government can bring is the intelligence that a private sector company doesn't have, and the threat reporting, and then to overlay that on sort of their critical infrastructure and how they look at the system. And so the more that they can talk and collaborate together, the better we're going to be. And so CISA has a number of partnerships set up to do just that. It's a little innovative for the federal government, but it's not completely unique. FAA does this, and a few others do this. So we need to continue to adapt to that. On China's a relatively when I say new issue from the department, it's how do we, during my time I wanted to address what are the threats to the homeland from China, specifically from a nation state like China, and then what are our authorities, and then how do we combat that across the Homeland Security enterprise? And so again, that's one of these areas where if you just look at CBP or CISA, then in their silo, they'll have a set of responsibilities and they'll execute on that. But what we need folks doing is looking across their individual vectors and how do we come together as a department to pull all our authorities and resources together, prioritize, and then address the threat of the day. So we have a China working group that I believe the Biden administration is continuing, and that's a good sign of how do we do just that. And so whether it's from an immigration perspective, whether it's Chinese students coming to the U.S. and perhaps abusing their visa, doing some research they probably shouldn't be doing, their visa overstays, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's foreign investment in the U.S. from a national security perspective. There's a number of things that I think gives the department and gives the national security apparatus within the United States government some concerns regarding China. And I think we have to remember that their outlook here is to be a superpower, is to overtake the United States. And I don't think we can really lose sight of that. There's some ways that we can work with them, but in many cases, they're our adversary as well. And so the department needs to look at that as far as how do we secure and maintain the homeland and maintain, probably most importantly, our economic security, which we saw obviously during COVID. If we're reliant on supplies and materials coming from overseas, particularly China and other parts, what does that do to our economic security? Because with our economy goes our security. And so that's another important piece the department does.
Well, they haven't been quiet about their wanting to take over the world. So it's not really a big secret. I find it important, the point that you made, because while we sometimes operate in these silos of excellence, our adversaries don't. There's no rules. So we have to, understand that. And you at the greatest level at DHS, probably more than others, understand that. So tell us, what are some more of the challenges that DHS might be facing over the next few years?
Yeah, so we certainly talked about China. I would say other nation state threats, particularly, in the vein of cybersecurity. Because what we're going to see is we're going to probably see more and more attacks from threat actors that probably have some tie to nation states. And to your point, as the ability to compete with the U.S. on a traditional level, a military level, or a kinetic level is probably not in their self-interest. So they're going to try other areas, and the cyber sphere is certainly one that we've seen that they have a record of doing. So we've got to figure out how to hold them accountable, to identify them, obviously disrupt, respond, identify, and then attribute to these individuals. And so we saw that with the SolarWinds attack. A lot of press reporting out there about it's obviously Russia, nation state. And so I know the Biden administration is looking at responses, whether that's sanctions, expulsions, or whatever it might be. And so I certainly encourage that. We did a fair number of that over the last 4 years, particularly regarding Russia, a lot of sanctions on individuals and businesses, making sure that we're holding them accountable and letting them know that is not acceptable behavior at the end of the day.
Yeah. And is there anything besides what you mentioned about doing things differently in this, operating actually across the department? Are there more recommendations that you would have to meet these challenges that we're facing?
Let me just hit on a few more challenges if I can, because I think it's important as DHS moves forward. Obviously, domestic extremism is obviously sort of front and center, always has been for the department, but obviously it came into the forefront on January the 6th. And so there's a lot of good work that the department has done over the years. 2019 and 2020, we put out a strategy on combating extremism, putting a grant program in place and trying to push out enough resources in the prevention area. I think this is an area that the department doesn't have a lot of actual authorities in, if you can believe it or not. So when we talk about domestic terrorism or domestic terrorists, really the bulk of that is around investigations and prosecutions, which is a Department of Justice, responsibility. DHS can provide some assistance on the law enforcement side and the investigation side, but really what DHS's responsibility is to share any of that threat information with our state and local partners, right, through our fusion centers.
I have a number of alumni who are running those for DHS and engaging our state and local partners and I'm seeing it every day. And it's an incredible work that you guys have been doing with that particular office.
I think that will continue to be a challenge because the way in which DHS pulls information is very different than the intelligence community, right? Just because, it's domestic citizens. So you're not collecting on them. So you're having to use open source information, and we're having to rely a lot on law enforcement. They have ways that they get information, and then it feeds it back into the bigger machine, and then we'll have to cull through that. So that continues to be a challenge. So we share information with our state and local partners, and then I mentioned a little bit about a grant program that we have, and we're trying to provide grants to NGOs and to community-based programs because they know their communities a lot better than the federal government does. And so we're trying to equip them with the resources so that they can identify individuals that are prone to radicalizing to violence and provide off ramps to them, provide some counter messaging to them in the right way. We'll have to see how effective those are at the end of the day. As you indicated, we want to make sure that we have a good return on the investment, on the taxpayer investment. But that's, those are two principal ways that, and through other grants, DHS provides its response. So that's going to continue to be a challenge for the department as we continue to move forward. We talked a little bit about cybersecurity. I think election security, obviously 2020 election is done, but we'll have the 22 midterms and then the 24. So a lot of work will continue around election security. And what happened in 16 was different than 20, which will be different than 24. So that's kind of an evolving threat that will always be a challenge for the department. And so I think it's there. We can talk about Coast Guard for a minute, because Coast Guard is often not mentioned a lot, but their presence in the Arctic, I think, as a federal government trying to compete with China, with Russia, with other Arctic nations for a lot of the resources and just the safety and security of the Arctic region, that relies on the Coast Guard, and their resources are strained. And so it's important that we continue to look at that. And I think that will be a real challenge as the department goes forward, making sure that they've got the right type of capital assets. Those are, icebreakers and capital cutters, which are not inexpensive. So that's always going to be an issue from a budget standpoint and moving forward. And then overall, I would say, just particularly here recently, the political environment in which DHS operates is proving more and more difficult. And, 4 or 5, maybe a little bit longer than that, there were very few things within the Homeland Security enterprise, which was, really controversial, a lot of bipartisan approach. And I've seen that kind of wane over the years. So that will be a challenge. I don't know that unfortunately, that's going to go away much, but we'll see. So they've got a few challenges as they move forward.
Well, I think that's indicative of our culture. We have such a, either this or that. We don't have a lot of middle ground in our culture, and that just it's perfect for politics to be, more divisive than together. But I've seen people like you who've served in multiple government positions, going in and out of government and coming back to serve. I just think that that's really important for our country to know, for the people that don't understand that there are just thousands and thousands of fellow citizens who serve in government who just want to do good work and serve their country. So sounds kind of Pollyanna, but I think I know it's true. I see it every day. I get to tell those stories, but I just don't think we say that enough. We don't tell those good news stories that enough to help bring that culture together.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And it's a challenge. And it weighs on the men and women of the department because, they watch the news just like you and I do, and top leadership of the department. And so they see they see the type of environment, and it's tough. It's tough on them to do their mission as well.
Yeah.
But to answer, maybe I'll go back to another question you asked, what the department can be doing differently, perhaps. And there's a couple of points I'd like to raise there. One is making sure that, I think it's incumbent upon the department to really articulate what the threat to the homeland is to the American people. I think it's a very basic question, but it's a question that over the years, I haven't seen the department really do a good job. We do a good job, or I should say DHS does a good job of collecting that information and discussing it internally, how to deal with it. But I think the American people are part of that Homeland Security enterprise that I talked about earlier. And we've got to equip them with, you need to be on the lookout for this, or you need to be aware of this. We're not asking them to be active participants.
Right.
They're not going to go out and, run a program for the department, but they can be more they can be more, observant when they get on the internet or when they get on Facebook to understand what is disinformation. What does that look like? So I think it's incumbent upon the department to talk about the threats in a very public way. And so we started that last year with the Homeland Threat Assessment, which is a public document, public-facing document that goes through all the major threats the department is facing. So it gives folks a good idea about what the department is spending their time, energy, and resources on. And I really think that should be accomplished at the end of the day. So that's certainly one. Again, I've talked about another one, which is just that interagency or that internal collaboration and synergy that the department needs to fulfill its mission at the end of the day. FEMA can't do its mission alone. Responding to wildfires or disasters, they can't do it by themselves. They will fail. So they need other elements of the department. The Secret Service cannot run protection, in an election year for 15 different candidates. They don't have the resources and bandwidth. So what do? They draw other law enforcement officers from DHS into that mission. And so they're going to have to continue to do this as we move forward. And then I think, differently, they're going to have to look at their core competencies, whether that's the counter-terrorism mission, the border and immigration mission. And I think they're going to need to continue to challenge themselves of how do we do this differently in an age where resources are constrained and you're not really getting a lot of new authorities from Congress these days. How do we continue to use what we have in a different way, knowing that the threat, the adversary, whoever it might be, continues to evolve as well.
So we're an education institution, and my last question centers around specific policies or areas of policy that you think would be advantageous for us to research going forward.
So I would say areas I would probably focus on, I think would provide value while I was at DHS. Anything having to do with cybersecurity, we're always going to need outside expertise around that. Critical infrastructure, how do we look at supply chain security? How do we look at the critical infrastructure sectors, 16 different sectors? How do we categorize that? How do we look at the impacts of those sectors if there's a disruption, whether that's a man-made disruption or a natural disruption? And then how do we limit that to make sure that the network or the industry itself is resilient enough to get back up and running directly after an event of some kind? I'm going to bounce around here a little bit. Transnational criminal organizations, particularly those in Mexico and south of the border, are absolutely top of mind because it's not only individuals they're smuggling or trafficking, but obviously it's the drugs. 70,000 deaths a year, American deaths a year from illegal drugs. The vast majority of them come through that southern border, or it's illegal contraband of some kind. So there's certainly a criminal element on that border that needs to be addressed in a comprehensive way. I'm not sure, the department kind of does that on a individual basis and really kind of the 3 meter target, what's in front of us. How do we look at that long term? And that's a big issue I just threw out there.
A lot of them are.
That's an easy thing to do. And then I would just say overall, we've got a couple of FFRDCs and RAND and MITRE that are helping us with. The department collects an immense amount of data, whether that's trade data, that's traveler data, whatever the data might be. And how do we use that in the smartest, best way, most efficient way to secure the homeland? And I think we do that, fairly good. We have a national targeting center. We have a national vetting center that looks at bringing some of this data streams in. But there's probably better ways that we can do that as well. So I know a couple of different entities are already looking at that, but I think as we move forward, there's probably some good ideas there as well.
Well, we're coming to the close of our time, and I just wanted to ask you the final question, which is, when you look back over your term, what were you proudest of? What were the things? Give me 3 things that you were the proudest
Well,
of.
that's a tough one. That's a tough one. You know, I'll kind of go chronologically a little bit. So in 2017, as I mentioned, we battled a very historic hurricane season where we had Hurricane Harvey, Maria, and I'm forgetting the other one that hit Florida. Basically week after week after week. And the response to that was quite extensive. Again, I think a lot of people can be critical, but we got the necessary resources and help to folks in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico at the end of the day. And a lot of those were historic storms that, none of those entities had really ever seen before, particularly Texas and Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. So proud of the work that we did there, proud of the work on responding to COVID. Mm-hmm. The department was on the front line of that, particularly as we instituted travel restrictions. And then when FEMA really took over that task force and brought some structure to it. And so there was a lot of work, not only from FEMA, CBP, but also CISA, designating critical infrastructure sectors and making sure that people could go to work when there were state, bans of doing that, making sure that we kept the economy running, I think has been, critically important. Some of the counter-terrorism measures that we did, but also some of the border and immigration measures. I think at the end of the day, that'll continue to be an area that's, probably going to have a lot of public opinion around it. But I think bringing integrity back to that immigration system, however one's able to do that, is a good thing. Mm-hmm. I think that system, as most people will say, is broken. And so the question is, how do you fix it? And we took a number of steps to try to try to root out the fraud and bring some integrity back to that system. And the question is whether people, like that and want to see that continue, or they want to see something else. So all of those, very proud of the work that we did. I think we did good work. So.
Good. Well,
that one.
We appreciate your service and look forward to all the great things you'll do in the private sector. And just appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. And again, I think what the center does is great for our Homeland Security professionals and everyone else who might be watching this. So thank you for what you guys do.
All right. Take care.
All right, thank you.